People make wild claims about injury prevention. If you train in a certain way, if you do a certain exercise, it's going to limit or reduce your chances of injuries. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I've been working with people for going on 15 years now, from strength coaching, working with elite level powerlifters, and also helping them rehab as a physiotherapist. The magic of injury prevention is through training, through technique, and doing things in a repeatable way, time and time again. The reality is, shit happens from time to time, and there's no way that you can ever fully prevent an injury. But I think if you're process-driven in the way that you think about training, about your training blocks, about your training execution, it starts to remove a lot of variables. And what we want to do in strength training and what we want to do with injury minimization and with rehab, we want to control all the variables that we possibly can. So one of the easiest way is to making sure that you have all of the available range that you have access to be able to do the movements that you want to do. You need to be training in a conducive way that stacks up wins week in, week out, in a progressive overload manner. You don't want any massive spikes. And you want to make sure that the way that you train is something that you enjoy, is something that you can progress with over time. Because if you're stimulated by training, you're also going to put effort in. If you put effort in, you're going to care about the outcome. And if you care about the outcome, it means that you're going to put more overall effort into the smaller components that make up the process. Now, in today's video, I want to run through the key pillars of injury prevention. From my lens, I own and operate a strength training facility and a rehab clinic. So I get to work with amazing people every single day. And I can tell you right now that your biggest predictor of success moving forward in the gym and making epic progress year on year is controlling variables and having a process within your training system. So to kick off the video, I'm going to take you into one of the treatment rooms and I'm going to show you what I'm talking about in terms of range of movement. If you have more range available to you, you're going to be able to access and use it. But I want to show you a simple way of thinking about it on a table first, and then we'll take you into the gym. One of the most underrated components of your training when you're thinking about injury prevention and minimization is range of movement. Now, to kick this off, I'm not talking about being a yoga bunny where you bring your head to your foot. It's having enough range of movement that you can actually get into the positions that you need to do the exercise that you're doing. Now, if we think about a squat, for instance, there's requirements that we need to do in terms of baseline range of movement to actually do the movement itself. If you don't have those movements, it means that you're essentially fighting yourself or you have resistance from yourself, which really, if you think about it, it's not the smartest strategy. You want to make sure that you can get into movements effectively without resistance so that you can then focus on the things that matter most, which is the training itself, your cueing, your position, your technique, and your intent when you lift. So I'm going to run through the example of squatting and the requirements that you actually need in terms of range of movement to perform a squat. Now, if we have a look, I'm going to first start off by showing it passively, and we're going to go out to the gym in a moment and we're going to have a look at what it looks like if you want to have a look at it yourself. So when you think about squatting, if you just think about it simplistically, you need to be able to bring your knee up towards your chest. But what you actually need to be able to do is do it in a position that is similar to your squat. Now, if, say, for instance, Joe could only get to here, we can already say that he can't get full range of movement because he can't get his knee past that parallel line. So we would need to look at hip flexion. Now, something that's spoken about in our industry a lot is hip internal rotation. Now, Joe has just competed over the weekend in a powerlifting comp and is quite stiff, but you need about 30 degrees to 45 degrees of hip internal rotation, which is essentially bringing the leg out here. What that tells us is when he comes down into a squat, he has enough range of movement at the back of his hip to be able to allow that tissue to stretch so that he can get into the bottom of a squat without jamming his bones together. Very simply put, but it's a really important component. So we often do a lot to train hip internal rotation, but we also need to make sure that we actually have the range at the back of the hip, because on the opposite side of the hip external rotators are the internal rotators. And to get into internal rotation, you need the external rotators to let go. So if we then go a little bit further and have a look at the knee, we're going to need at least 90 degrees of knee flexion, which all good, he has there. And then the last component is on a bent knee, how far can he pull his toes up towards his shin? Now, for squatting, especially low bar squatting, you don't really need a lot of range of movement through the ankle. Essentially, with the compression that you have from the weight, how you set up your position in order to get into the squat, you don't need a lot of range of movement. Often the ankles are, blamed as a culprit of, reducing range of movement, but in a lot of cases, they are not the culprit. It's actually your body positioning and how you stack it. So if we zoom out a little bit, any exercise that you need to do, you need to have the available range of movement. It doesn't mean that you need excessive movements. You just need enough. So this is how we would assess it in a treatment room from a physio or a chiropractic standpoint. We'd be looking at the hips, making sure that you have enough range of movement. Can they get the leg away from the midline? There's all these small components that we would look at, and you don't need to get bogged down with the details, but whatever movement you're doing, you need to be able to reverse engineer it and go, what do I need to get into? How do I look at it? So that then if you do need to work on mobility, you can have very specific drills. If you do need to work on control and strength, you also have very specific drills. Now I'm going to show you what that looks like out in the gym so that if you're warming up for, say, squats, you have a really simple way of looking at it. So I think one of the simplest ways to look at, do you actually have enough range of movement, is can you squat and sit comfortably in the bottom of a squat position? So I get Joe to do a couple of squats here. If you can't sit and hold that position at the bottom comfortably, the chances are that you're working around some sort of compensation, some sort of movement pattern, whether you're restricted in terms of range or your body isn't aligned and stacked in the right position. If you cannot sit down into it, adding weight to it is not going to solve your problem. It's only going to magnify it. Now, us as humans, we have a very good way of adapting to things. We can very easily work around things and find solutions because we're survivors, it's what we do, but it's not the optimal strategy. So what I would prefer to see is Joe to jump down into a 90-90 hip position. Now I'm going to keep this super practical. We need a certain amount of range of movement at the hip, at the knee, at the ankle to actually do a squat, for instance. Now in this position here, if Joe brings both his hands forward, if he hinges over here, he will instantly get feedback of where he's tight. Now, where are you feeling that now? Okay, so right now he's getting feedback that the back of his hip is feeling tight. Now, often you will also get a lot of tension in the front part of these hips as well. Now, say for instance, Joe was trying to roll his hip forward here. That means that he's limited in hip extension. So the front of his hip, his TFL, maybe his glute med, his glute min, all of that area is really, really jacked up. That's limiting his hip extension. But in this instance, he's saying that he's feeling it more in the back. So that's giving us a little bit of feedback that the back of his glute is tight. So let's compare that with the opposite side. Now in this side here, does it feel the same?
Similar on the right, but
yep.
left side is
So now on this side, he's reporting that the left side of the hip is actually feeling a lot tighter. So we're starting to piece together a little bit here that his left back of hip and left front of hip is actually a lot tighter than the right side. So this is a really easy way for him to start to screen himself to see if he actually has the required movement to get into the bottom of a squat position. Now come back to the opposite side. Now, with all things practical in terms of training, a lot of the time we can use assessments as actual drills themselves. So this one here, we can actually use this drill to mobilize the back of the hip. Now, if I get Joe to come back up to his hands, I can get him to think about squaring his hips off, pushing that as far forward as he possibly can, and then thinking about bringing himself over the top of his leg and hinging down. Now that movement there is starting to really stretch out the back of the hip. You could do 5 or 10 reps here, transition to the opposite side and do it. Now, another common complaint with this particular exercise and a movement requirement we need is the ability to actually pull the leg away from the body. So say Joe was doing that here and the inside of his leg was really, really tight, which is actually a common complaint. We go, okay, well, his adductors are feeling a little bit tight. Let's work on getting some range of movement there. So I'm gonna get Joe up into what we call an adductor rock position. So it's essentially squaring up as if he's in a deadlift position. You're pushing this hip down so it's nice and flat and stretching that leg out as far away from the body as you possibly can. And then I'll get him to rock back onto his heel. Now in this position here, where are you feeling that?
Right, yeah.
Okay, so he's feeling it exactly where we thought, in his adductor. Now for him, if we rock back, it's probably going to get tighter as it goes. And if he comes forward a little bit, it's going to ease off a little bit. Now we can, again, use this. We've assessed it. We know it's tight. We can actually bring his torso now towards the side that he's stretching, if you walk your hands across. And now that's going to crank it up even further. And then from that position, he can sit back and rock forward and rock backward into it. Now, this is a really, really good drill to do just to open up the range of movement in the groin, because as we're squatting down into the bottom of a squat, we need that range of movement to actually be able to get into the bottom of the squat. Now, once you've done some of the hip 90-90s, you've done some of the adductor rocks, Joe can get back into a 90-90 hip position and retest how it's moving. If it is still moving a little bit stiff and you know that there's more range of movement there, you can also then go and do other drills, such as loaded adductor mobilization, elevated pigeon or pigeon stretches, and we can also use tools such as trigger point to actually get some blood flow and some range of movement. But this is just an example of why you need range of movement, because the position that you can get in dictates the movement that you can do. In my world, in the physio world, structure dictates function. So if you use that with movement as well, if you cannot actually do something, the reality is you probably can't perform it that well. Now, this is just an example for the squat, but I wanted to show the relevance. Now, before we finish this up, Joe, if you jump up into a standing position, I'm gonna get him to retest his squat. It's a perfect way to do things. Assess, intervene, and then go and do the movement again. See if it feels better before starting to load it. Does that feel any different?
A little looser.
Little bit looser, okay? So we haven't done a lot of work on that, but it's providing a good result already. So there's less resistance in his system and he's gonna be able to get more out of his squats. Now, anyone that knows me knows that I bang on all the time about having a repeatable process time and time again. Now, I don't just say that. There's reasons for it. The more predictable you are in the stimulus that you provide your body in terms of training, in terms of rehab, in terms of outcomes, the better results you are going to get. Now, if we look with a lens of movement and injury prevention, if you do things in a very predictable way, time and time again, you're going to get feedback when things aren't working well, and you're going to get feedback in terms of progress when things are working right. Now, without having a consistent process, you never actually have an opportunity to assess whether things are working well. Now, if we look at any industry, not just training, not just health, not just fitness, every industry has a rule or a standard operating process or procedure that we work by. I always use the medical industry just as a reference point, but you know, it's like a surgeon. Imagine if you were going in for an operation and a surgeon just comes up and just picks a random spot, cuts a hole and just goes for it. You're not going to feel very confident. The surgery is probably not going to be very good and the outcomes are going to be skewed because there's no consistent way of doing things. So if we look at injury minimization or prevention, we need to think of training technique as a massive pillar to that. And you need to have a consistent process of how you're doing it. Now, without a consistent process-driven way of training in terms of structure of your training program and technical execution, it's going to be very hard to get a consistent effort and consistent feedback of whether the training is working properly or not. Because when you do things in a process-driven way, you give consistent efforts, you get consistent results, it means that your outcome is very, very predictable. So where we run into a lot of problems is when we add variability or we change things without really considering what the opposite side of that is. When there's big changes in your training technique, or you're just throwing novel random exercises into the mix for fun, or you're working way above the capacity that you have the ability to do because you're stimulated, because you're in a new environment, it doesn't mean that it's going to carry over to actually doing things well. It means that it probably is just going to put you at risk of having an injury or overloading certain structures, which later on down the road can lead to injury. So I bang about this all the time. Processes, you need to have them as part of your training technique. Otherwise, it's just guesswork. If you're guessing your way through a training technique, you are going to run into obstacles all the time. And I see this with hip pain, I see this with back pain, I see this with shoulder pain. People are figuring out their technique on the fly. They're figuring it out as they do the movements. That is a recipe for pain. That is a recipe for injury because there's no predictable way of doing it and there's no predictable way of actually building tissue, resilience, building strength, building muscle mass because you're doing it randomly every single time. So being process driven is an absolute superpower in injury minimization and your ability to stay in the game and essentially continue to train. Do things predictable ways because it is a superpower. Now, the next big component to think about is building momentum. Training is like a savings account. You're constantly adding little bits to it and over time it compounds. Whether it's trying to build muscle mass, whether you're trying to rehab from an injury, whether you're trying to work on your skill and lift heavy weights, there should be no session that has a massive spike. So if we have a look at this, and this is a 5-week training program. Week 1, you're either gonna push up the intensity or the volume, and you're gonna continue that trend all the way through a training block, and then you'll have a dip off where you have essentially a deload week. That allows your body to recover. Now you can see there that the line is it's a straight line, it's predictable, and every single week we're adding a little bit to it, whether that's volume, whether that's intensity, it doesn't matter. We're progressing over time. Now, what we want to avoid, massively avoid, is having massive spikes in your training intensity or volume. One, your body probably isn't going to be that well adapted to handle the stresses. Your body's going to freak out and go, wow, I wasn't ready for that. The reality is you're probably going to get it done. You're probably going to be able to withstand it, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. Now, like I've written that down here because, I could come in every single session and work up to a heavy single, but is that necessarily going to make me stronger long term? Probably not, because I'm going to get fatigued neurologically, my motivation's going to be down, and over time, I'm getting exposure to heavy weights over and over and over again. So the risk reward starts to come a little bit unbalanced. So main point here is training adaptation happens consistently and progressively over time. You don't want to have any massive spikes because it's going to skew your training progress. And ultimately what happens is, say you have a 6-week training block and in week 2 of your training program, you spike your volume or intensity, it means that the weeks after that are actually going to suffer. The progress that you can make in them, you're going to carry fatigue, and you're potentially not going to put up as much effort or get as good results in those weeks because you've cooked yourself in week 2 of your training program. So I always say, build momentum into your training weeks. So if you have a 5-week training block, for instance, then a deload, the first 2 weeks are like foundational weeks. You're getting into training, you're getting into the flow of things, you're figuring out your new exercises. The next 2 weeks are development blocks, or development weeks, I should say, where you're then starting to consolidate the efforts of week 1 and 2. And then you move into a performance week. And that performance week is when you give things a nudge. Now, if you're training for strength, you're obviously going to push up the intensity. And if you're building muscle mass, that's when you're probably pushing up the intensity, but you're looking to add volume to the actual sessions themselves. So it drives the stimulus of adaptation. So moral of the story is build momentum because there's no one single session that is going to make or break your training progress. But it can cause a massive detriment to your long-term progress because it overloads the system and puts you at risk of slowing down your progress, but more importantly, at risk of injury. And it's just so unnecessary. Now, to wrap up this video, I'm going to summarize, honestly, key players in keeping you in the game. I've been working with people for going on 15 years now in the strength and rehab space. I can tell you time and time again that you will only make significant and great progress if you can continue to train. I see so many people that end up with injuries that could have been avoided, whether that's through poor technique, poor training programs and systems, and not having a long-term view and treating each session as a make or break. Now, if we wrap all this up, your training technique cannot be understated. The better position that you're in, the better understanding of where you need to be at space, means that you can execute things at a high level time and time again with consistency. This is an absolute superpower because if you have a consistent way of doing things, it means that you can consistently get results. Freestyling leaves room for you to fall out of position or to potentially overload something or do a movement pattern that your body is not ready for. So do yourself a favor and really start to think about your training as a system, as a process, because it will allow you to get consistent results over time. When we have a look at your actual training program itself, there's no session that should be a huge jump on any other session, whether that's training volume or training intensity. I say this all the time, boring works. Boring and simplicity works every single time because training isn't about novel stimulus. Training is about repeatedly stacking up wins time and time again. That gives you self-confidence in what you can do. It helps your body adapt to the training stimulus that you're providing. And over time, you're going to turn into an absolute weapon in the gym. That's what we want. So we need to start to think about our actions in terms of the return on investment. And when we think about return on investment, we don't think about weeks. We don't think about sessions. We think about months, years, training blocks, because let's be real, we're all in this for the long term, right? Now, you're gonna find that a lot of people will say, you don't need mobility, you don't need to work on movement, you don't need to work on anything other than strength training. But I'm here to tell you right now, they're wrong. I've been doing this and I can show instantly people's change in performance through unlocking movement. And what I'm not saying, and what I've tried to reiterate through this entire episode is I'm not saying you need to turn into a yoga muddy. You need to have the available movement, the available range to actually execute at a high level. If you don't have it, it's guesswork. It's leaving everything up to chance, which honestly, as a lifter, as someone that is process driven, really isn't a variable that I think most people are comfortable with. So get consistent, do things in a repeatable way, and start to think about your training as movement, not just outcomes. Now, if you want to stay up to date with my latest episodes on podcast and YouTube, below I have a link to sign up for my newsletter. It is the best way to get access to the weekly content. I'll see you guys on the next episode.